The Battle of Nicopolis, 25th of September, 1396. It stands as one of the final and most dramatic clashes of the medieval crusading era, and an illustration of the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire into southeast Europe. Taking place near the fortified town of Nicopolis in present-day Bulgaria, this monumental confrontation saw a coalition of Western European knights and soldiers, led by the ambitious King Sigismund of Hungary, embark on a last-ditch crusade to hold back the Ottoman advance. But despite their valiant efforts, and a formidable army united under the cross, the vastly superior and strategically adept Ottoman forces under Sultan Bayezid I delivered a crushing defeat, decimating the Allied army and securing the Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. This was a battle that not only marked the definitive end of large-scale crusading endeavors, but also showed the shifting power dynamic in Europe, paving the way for the Ottomans to solidify their control and influence for centuries to come, until the one day when the pendulum swings back. And the pendulum always swings. Welcome to the channel, everyone. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you. Those coming back, great to have you with me again. Been doing a few battles lately. Now, then part of broader conflicts, sure, but there always are these junctions and turning points in world history, and the pendulum usually swings on top of a giant pile of corpses. That's usually how it goes. So, with that being said, if you like this sort of stuff, like and subscribe to the channel, and hey, even tell your friends about it. It's all a big party here. Now let's begin. We go back to the 14th century. Well, where we find ourselves at this time of the 14th century, we also find a large number of small crusades, all led by individual knights or kings, all with their individual goals. Now, there was a continuous fighting in northern Europe along the Baltic coast, rather troublesome area, and the most recent was a failed crusade against Tunisia. This happened around 1390. And the main player was, of course, the Byzantine Empire, which was having a little bit of trouble during its sunset years. I'm sure you know what happens some 60 years later. They were confined to the immediate vicinity of Constantinople of this time, what could hardly be called an empire anymore, and the Ottomans had blockaded them, starting in 1394, after they had taken control of most of the Balkans following the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Things were not looking good. While his brother Ivan Sratsimir continued to hold Vidin, but was regulated to the status of an Ottoman vassal, the Bulgarian Tsar Ivan Shishman had lost Nicopolis, his temporary capital, to the Ottomans in 1393. The crusade was seen by the Bulgarian boyars, despots, and other independent Balkan rulers as a fantastic opportunity to completely undo the Ottoman conquest and retake the Balkans from the Islamic heathens. Furthermore, the Islamic Christian front line had gradually approached the Kingdom of Hungary. The border between the two religions in Eastern Europe was now the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Hungarians themselves, they knew they were at risk of attack. Onto the Republic of Venice, the great shipping and commerce empire. Well, they were concerned that Ottoman over the Adriatic, Ionian, and Aegean seas would diminish if they took control of the Balkan Peninsula, which included Venetian lands like portions of Morea and Dalmatia. The Republic of Genoa, on the other hand, was concerned that the Ottomans would eventually acquire a monopoly over the trade routes between Europe and the Black Sea, where the Genoese had numerous colonies, and significant ones at that, including Amasra, Sinop, and Kaffa. If they were going to take control of the Danube River and the Turkish Straits, well, that could affect profits. Additionally, the Genoese owned the citadel of Galata, which Bayezid had besieged in 1395, and which was situated in Constantinople, north of the Golden Horn. Although the Western Schism had divided the papacy in two, with rival popes at Avignon and Rome, and the days when a pope could declare a crusade were long, long gone, Pope Boniface IX decided to go back to the glory days, just like Urban before him, and Innocent after that, and he declared a new crusade against the Turks in 1394. It was on. Philip II, Duke of Burgundy, and the ongoing 100 Years' War between England and Richard II of France under Charles VI were two main forces behind the formation of the last crusade. The conflict had reached one of its sporadic truces in 1389. Additionally, in the interest of peace, Richard II promised to marry Isabella, the daughter of Charles VI, in March of 1395. Thus the two kings met in October 1396 on the outskirts of Calais to approve the union and extend the Truce of Lullingham. Another important factor was the backing of Burgundy, one of the strongest French aristocracies, a name still recognizable till today, of course. Guy de la Tremoille, Burgundy's envoy, travelled to Venice and Hungary in 1391 to assess the situation as the country struggled to decide whether to send a crusade to Prussia or Hungary. Although none of them would eventually join the crusade, Burgundy had originally envisioned a crusade headed by himself and the Dukes of Orleans and Lancaster. It was highly unlikely that the Crusade's defense against the Turks was regarded as a top priority. Now, we have notes from the historian Barbara Tuchman of our modern times. Because he was the prince of self-magnification, the result was that opulent display became the dominant theme. Plans, logistics, and intelligence about the enemy came second, if they came at all. Well, that's a poor review, isn't it? Burgundy's motivation for sponsoring the crusade was to increase his and his house's prestige and power. In January of 1395, Burgundy informed King Sigismund of Hungary that an official request to the King of France would be granted after obtaining 120,000 livres from Flanders in 1394. Just enough to start the crusade preparations. 4 knights and a bishop from Sigismund's delegation travelled to the Paris court in August to describe how over 40,000 Turks were destroying and endangering Christian territories, and to plead for assistance on Sigismund of Hungary's behalf. Charles VI was able to respond that it was his duty to defend Christianity and punish Sultan Bayezid after securing peace with England through his daughter's marriage. The declaration was met, of course, with a great amount of enthusiasm by French nobles, including Philip of Artois, Count of O, the French constable, and Jean Le Manger, the French marshal, who declared that it was the responsibility of every man of valor to join the crusade, meaning, of course, if you did not join, You were not a man of valor. And nobody wants to live with that title, don't they? John I, then Count of Nevers, and later Duke of Burgundy, was another important participant. Of the main commanders of the French troops dispatched to assist in the conflict was him. John received the cognomen Fearless for his valor in the conflict. In terms of sources, we have the Chronica Hungarorum. I almost said Hungarum. Hungarorum, rather. That states that King Sigismund of Hungary was so ecstatic to see the sizable army encircling him in Buda that he joyfully cried out, "Who would be so bold as to dare resist us? With the spears we carry, we would also hold up the sky if its immense weight fell upon us, protecting us from harm." Sounds pretty confident, doesn't he? Well, in other historical accounts, the number of combatants is of course highly debated. According to modern estimates, the Battle of Nicopolis was so important that medieval chroniclers gave up to 400,000 fighters on average. Both sides, of course, maintained that the enemy outnumbered them 2-1, which gave the Crusaders some comfort in their defeat and enhanced the glory of the Turks' victory. Of course, it is disputed this commonly cited number of 100,000 Crusaders. It would have taken 100,000 men a month to cross the Danube at Iron Gate, whereas it took the Crusaders 8 days. The number is simply just not practical. The German follower of a Bavarian noble, Johann Schildberger, who saw the battle at the age of 16. Well, it's something to see the age of 16, isn't it? And was taken prisoner and held as a slave for 30 years by the Turks before returning home, actually wrote a narrative of the conflict that came closest to a first-person account. And he had estimated that the Crusaders' strength at the final battle to be about 17,000. But of course, he also exaggerated the Turkish forces to a frankly ridiculous 200,000. There's just no way. 2-1 is something, but almost 10-1. Come on. Well, an estimated 11,000 men, including 6,000 archers and foot soldiers selected from the finest volunteer and mercenary companies, joined the approximately 5,000 knights and squires who had enlisted from France. The Knights Hospitaller of Rhodes, who had been the main representatives of Christianity in the Levant since the fall of Constantinople and Cyprus, came next in significance. Hungarian envoys urged German princes from the Rhineland, Bavaria, Saxony, and other regions of the empire to join, and Venice provided a naval fleet for assisting action. People came to join the crusade after the French heralds had made tours of Poland, Bohemia, Navarre, and Spain to announce it. The much discussed and celebrated English participation simply never happened. One can only imagine how the battle would have went, and the crusade in general, if it had have happened. Also, the Italian city-states were far too preoccupied with their usual violent infighting to take part. Rather unfortunate. Now, historiographer Aziz Atia and others who followed him took to Antonio Florentio's account of 3,000 English knights as fact. 4,000 to 6,000 men, and at least twice as many horses, would have been the true number of knights, excluding foot soldiers and other retainers. Nevertheless, there are no documents indicating that England was making the financial preparations to send a force overseas, or that the king had made necessary preparations to assemble and send such a force at all. Since Henry of Bolingbroke and all the other sons of the Duke of Lancaster, along with nearly all of the other notable nobles in the country, had documented at the king's wedding 5 months after the Crusade's departure. Reports of Henry or any other son of the Duke of Lancaster leading an English contingent must be untrue, unless we think that the wedding attendance list is untrue. But it is very unlikely that they would fabricate that. Now, since St. George was a patron of the English soldiers, Attila also believed that the invocation of the saint as a war cry at Nicopolis marked the arrival of the English soldiers. However, it is asserted that the cry was uttered by the French knight instead, Philippe d'O. Furthermore, unlike all the other nations that sent men to battle, England did not collect ransom money to pay for the captives. Knights Hospitaller of the English Lang subgrouping, who joined their fellow crusaders after leading Rhodes and sailing up the Danube, may be responsible for sporadic references to the existence of English in the modern accounts. The growing hostility between the king and the Duke of Gloucester, which may have persuaded them that they had better keep their supporters close, and the animosity resulting from the protracted English-French war, which led the English to refuse to consider placing themselves under a French-led crusade. One can hardly blame them, regardless of the recently concluded peace. Now, well, those are two possible explanations of why the English did not show up. Estimates of the Ottoman force's strength range from 15 to 20,000, although exaggerated numbers are also typical in this context. Well, according to a number of sources, the Ottoman historian Sukrula, who wrote in the 1460s, estimated the Ottomans' army's size to be around 60,000. It is sometimes referred to as about half of the Crusader Army. Once again, 2 to 1. A heroic battle, but a believable one. Prince Stefan Lazarevic, vassal and brother-in-law of Sultan Bayezid, since the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, commanded 1,500 Serbian heavy cavalry and knights in the Ottoman army itself. Philip, Duke of Burgundy, John of Gaunt, Louis of Orleans, had initially intended to lead the crusade, but all three of them withdrew, arguing that their presence was necessary for the peace talks with England, possibly also because none of them dared to leave the area around the throne if their main rivals remained. But by designating the Duke's eldest son, John, Count of Nevers, who was 24 years old at the time for nominal command, Burgundy maintained control over the business he was financing. Perhaps sensing that his son, Constable D'O, and Marshal Boucicaut, both under 35, lacked the requisite experience, Burgundy called the Lord of Cossé, the country's most seasoned warrior, that being Enjolras VII, and persuaded him to serve as Nevers' chief counselor during the crusade. The Crusaders' command structure's ambiguity would ultimately determine the outcome. Medieval warriors had not yet adopted this idea of unity of command. Well, whatever the situation is, they would have to test out whatever unity they have. Now, beginning April 30th, 1396, the crusade left Dijon and travelled via Strasbourg on the upper Danube to Bavaria. From there they joined Sigismund in Buda via river transportation, slightly more comfortable. The Crusaders' objectives, though they lacked specific planning, were to drive the Turks out of the Balkans, then seek Constantinople's assistance, cross the Hellespont and march through Syria and Turkey to free Palestine and the Holy Sepulchre, and then finally sail back to Europe in victory. Sounds like a pretty solid plan. Let's see how it works out. Plans were made for the Venetians to sail up the Danube to meet the Crusaders in Wallachia in July, and for the fleet of Venetian ships to blockade the Turks in the Sea of Marmara. Così was on a diplomatic assignment to the Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, and was not traveling with the Crusader body. Gian Galeazzo was trying to prevent the transfer of Genoese sovereignty to France because he was frankly angry at the French political scheming that had taken Genoa away from him. Così was sent to warn him that France would view any more intervention as hostile. There was more to the argument than politics, of course. In the same month that the crusade left Paris, Gian Galeazzo's beloved daughter, Valentina Visconti, the wife of the Duke of Orleans, had been banished from Paris as a result of Queen Isabeau's schemes. Following the catastrophe at Nicopolis, it was generally assumed that the Duke of Milan had informed Bayezid of the movements of the Crusader troops, despite his threats to dispatch knights to protect his daughter's honor. The Duke of Milan, who had killed his own uncle to secure his power, may have betrayed the Crusaders, but there is no concrete proof of this, and it is likely that Gian Galeazzo was used as a kind of scapegoat after the fact because of the ongoing hostility with the French. After finishing his diplomatic mission and traveling to Venice with Henry of Bar and many supporters, Così rented a ship on May 17th to transport him across the Adriatic Sea. On May the 30th, he landed in the Croatian port of Senj before traveling by land to the meeting place in Buda. After a meeting of the Croatian parliament in June, Croatian troops under Ban Nicholas II Garai marched from the seaside town of Nin to Buda, joining the Sigismund-led Royal Hungarian Army. Nevers, who had paused in the upper Danube for receptions and celebrations hosted by the German princes, was far behind Così. Nevers was a full month behind the Crusader vanguard under Dio and Boscart, arriving in Vienna on the 24th of June. While Nevers took pleasure in more parties hosted by his brother-in-law Leopold IV, Duke of Austria, a fleet of 70 Venetian ships, laden with provisions, was sent down the Danube. Following that, Nevers requested a frankly rude 100,000 ducat loan from his brother-in-law, which, well, it did take a little bit of time to arrange, but it was approved and finally brought to him in Buda in the month of July. Following the arrival of the leaders, the Venetian fleet representatives and Philibert de Nailac, master of the Knights Hospitaller, had to coordinate the strategy. The Hospitallers had been transported from Rhodes by 44 Venetian ships across the Aegean into the Sea of Marmara, and some of them had continued up the Danube and into the Black Sea without fighting. It is believed that Bayezid and most of his troops were already on the side of Europe because the Turks, who had a weaker naval force, frankly just did not challenge the Venetians for control of the sea. A heated argument broke out at the War Council in Buda. Bayezid had promised to attack Hungary by May of the previous year, but by the end of July he was nowhere to be found. The French declared him a coward after Hungarian scouts sent as far as the Hellespont failed to locate him. Hungary's Sigismund promised the Crusaders that Bayezid would not arrive, and suggested it would be better to let the Turks march to them rather than marching back to find them. The French and their allies rejected this approach, As the spokesman, Gozzi said, though Sultan's boasts be lies, that should not keep us from doing deeds of arms and pursuing our enemies, for that is the purpose in which we have come. Although chroniclers also note that Gozzi's speech aroused jealousy in Dole, who believed that he should be given the honor of leader because he was the Constable of France, Sigismund really had no choice but to comply. While a portion of the Hungarian army turned north to assemble the forces of Wallachia near Mercia the Elder and Transylvania, the Crusaders started to march down the Danube's left bank. The remaining Hungarian soldiers trailed behind the Crusader column. There had been reports of increased pillaging and abuse of the populace as the Crusaders advanced into Muslim-held territory. Crusaders had been known to occasionally plunder and do other terrible things with the women while traveling through Germany. Of course, this put a very bad spin on their reputation. But when they entered the schismatic territories, the French were said to have become even more undisciplined. Despite writing from, at best, second-hand accounts, chroniclers waxed about poetically about Crusaders' immorality and even their blasphemy, detailing drunken knights lying with women for coin for days on end. Well, over the course of 8 days, the column used boats and pontoons to cross the right bank at Orsova, where the Danube narrows at the Iron Gates Gorge. Vidin, the capital of western Bulgaria, before it was taken over by the Turks, was their first target. Ivan Stratimir of Bulgaria, the ruler of Vidin, quickly gave up because he had no desire to defend his Turkish conquerors against a vast Crusader force. The incident further convinced the French that Turks could not compete with the Crusaders in the field, for the only bloodshed was the execution of the Turkish officers in the defending garrison. Oryahovo, also known as Rachua, a powerful stronghold 120 kilometers from Vidin, was the next target. The French, frustrated at not being able to demonstrate their valor through military actions, carried out a night march, and a forced one at that, to get to the castle ahead of their allies. They arrived in the morning, just as the Turkish forces had emerged to demolish the bridge over the moat. The French took control of the bridge in intense fighting, but they could not advance until Sigismund showed up. Before nightfall compelled the fighters to retreat, the combined forces succeeded in reaching the walls, on the promise that their lives and properties would be protected. The residents of Oryahovo consented to surrender to Sigismund the following morning. But the agreement of Sigismund was immediately broken by the French, who massacred and pillaged the town as soon as the gates were opened. A betrayal. They later claimed that they had conquered the town because their men-at-arms had climbed the walls the previous evening. The town was burned down, and 1,000 residents, both Bulgarian and Turkish, were taken hostage, at least the ones that were still breathing. The French accused the Hungarians of attempting to deny them the honor of victory through battle, while the Hungarians viewed the actions of the French as a serious insult to their king. The Crusaders left a garrison to guard Oryahovo and proceeded towards Nicopolis, attacking a few forts or villages along the way, but avoiding one citadel where messengers managed to flee and alert Bayezid to the presence of the Christian army. The Crusaders arrived in sight of Nicopolis' forces on its limestone cliff on September the 12th. Nicopolis was a crucial stronghold, that controlled the lower Danube and the routes of communication to the interior because of its advantageous defensive location. You see, the fortress was actually two walled towns, the larger one on the cliff's heights and a smaller one below. It also had this small road running between the cliff and the river, and the cliff that dropped off sharply to the plain further inland from the fortified walls. The Turkish governor of Nicopolis, Doğan Bey, was ready to withstand a protracted siege, and was confident that Bayezid would have come to the town's aid. The town was also well defended and well supplied. If they needed to hold out for a while, they certainly could. Despite the fact that the Crusaders had not brought with them any siege machines, Boucicaut expressed optimism that brave men could easily make ladders, which were more valuable than catapults. However, it was impossible to take the castle by force due to its strong fortifications, the steep slope up the walls, and the lack of siege weapons. In order to starve out the defenders, the Crusaders established positions around the town to block the exits and established a siege with the naval blockade of the river. However, they didn't think that Bayezid would come so quickly to engage them in combat, and were certain that the siege of the fortress would only serve as a prelude to a significant push to liberate Constantinople. It's the good old hubris coming into play. Poor preparation. For 2 weeks, the disinterested Crusaders amused themselves with feasting and games and taunting their adversaries. The Crusaders deployed no sentries, even due to intoxication or negligence. But the word of the Turks' approach was spread by foragers who ventured outside the camps. By this point, Bayezid had already left Adrianople and was en route to Tinirvo via a forced march across the Shipka Pass. He was accompanied by his Serbian ally, Stefan Lazarevic. The 500 horsemen that Sigismund had dispatched to conduct force reconnaissance around Tinovo, 70 miles to the south, returned with news that the Turks were indeed approaching. Well, this is where it all goes wrong. The besieged residents of Nicopolis also heard the news, and they cheered and blew horns. All of a sudden, the party for the Crusaders seemed to have come to an end. But since he thought that the Sultan would never attack, Boucicaut said that the commotion of their celebration was simply a ruse. He also threatened to cut off the ears of anyone who spoke about the rumors of the Turks' approach, saying that it would be detrimental to the Crusaders' morale. Well, I think the cat's already out of the bag on that one. Now, Dekotsi, who had left a contingent of 500 knights and 500 mounted archers south, was one of the few who actually bothered to conduct any form of reconnaissance. He separated 200 horsemen to execute a feint retreat after learning of a sizable contingent of Turks approaching through a nearby pass. This attracted the pursuing Turks into an ambush, where the remaining members of his men, who were waiting in hiding, attacked the rear. Dekotsi's men killed as many as they could without mercy, and went back to their camp, where his action roused the camp from its sluggishness and won the other Crusaders' admiration. It also made the French more arrogant, and once more aroused Dior's resentment, who charged Kotsi with recklessly endangering the army and trying to usurp the honor and power of Nevers. On the 24th, Sigismund called a war council, and he and Mircea of Wallachia proposed a strategy for the conflict. The plan called for the Wallachian foot soldiers, who had fought the Turks before, to be sent in the first attack to confront the Turkish vanguard. These were typically poorly armed militiamen who were used to pillaging, but were also used to, in battle, to exhaust opponents before they encountered superior Turkish forces. According to Sigismund, knights should not pay any attention to such a vanguard. In order to support the attack and prevent the Turkish heavy cavalry known as the Sipahis from sweeping around the Crusaders' flanks, Sigismund suggested that the French form the front line to rush in after the initial clash had subsided, with the Hungarians and other allies shortly following after. Since the knights would have to follow peasant footmen into battle, Dale criticized the plan as being frankly demeaning to them. He said, "To take up the rear is to dishonor us and expose us to the contempt of all," and he added that he would take the front as constable, and that anyone in front of him would be a grave insult to him. Boucicault backed him in this, and Nevers was readily persuaded by the younger French lord's assurance. Sigismund departed to prepare a strategy for his own troops, after the French had launched a charge. He apparently informed the camp that Bayezid was only 6 hours away in a matter of hours. The Crusaders, who were reportedly completely drunk during dinner, reacted in quite a bewildered manner. Some rose in panic, some hurriedly prepared for battle, and some simply refused to believe the report. The prisoners captured at Rachawa were then massacred, allegedly due to a shortage of backup guards. Later on, even European chroniclers would refer to this as barbaric. The fighters started to band together under the leadership of their leaders at dawn on September 25th. Sigismund dispatched his Grand Marshal to Nevers to inform him that his scouts had spotted the Turkish vanguard and requested a 2-hour delay in the offensive. By then, his scouts would have returned with information on the enemy's number and disposition. Nevers called a hurried council of advisers, and the oldest French knight on the crusade, Jean de Vienne, and Coetzee both suggested following the Hungarian king's wishes. At this point, Doe stated that Sigismund was willing to lead the charge, and that he only wanted to keep the battle honors for himself. He was reportedly saying, "When truth and reason cannot be heard, then must rule presumption," said Vienne in response to Coetzee's declaration that Doe's words were presumption. The army must follow Doe's wishes if he wants to advance, but it would be better to move in tandem with the Hungarians and other allies, Vienne went on to remark. And the council also got into a heated argument after Doe rejected any weight, with the younger ones accusing the older knights of being afraid rather than cautious and wise. Doe's decision to move forward appears to have resolved the dispute. Nevers and Coetzee commanded the main body of the French knights, while Doe assumed command of the vanguard. To meet the Turks who were descending on the hills to the south, the French knights rode out to Nicopolis with their backs to their mounted archers. Under Sigismund, the Germans, Knights Hospitaller, and other allies remained with the Hungarian forces. Conflicting accounts obscure the events that followed. According to Tuchman, out of the welter of different versions, a coherent account of the movements and fortunes of the battle is not to be had. There is only a tossing kaleidoscope. Although the knights were hindered by rows of sharpened stakes intended to skewer their horses' stomachs, and came under intense fire from archers, the French charge vanquished the untrained conscripts in the Turkish front line and advanced into the lines of trained infantry. The Turkish infantry eventually fled behind the relative safety of the Sipahis. Chroniclers describe horses being impaled on stakes, riders dismounting, and stakes being pulled up to allow new horses to pass. It was suggested by Coetzee and Vian that the French take a break in order to reorganize their forces, rest, and give the Hungarians time to move up to a position where they could assist the French. But unaware of the size of the Turkish force, the younger knights overruled them, insisting on pursuing Bayezid because they had thought that they had just routed his army. Thus, the French knights proceeded up the hill. However, reports indicate that by this time over half were walking, either because they had dismounted to pull up stakes, or because the lines of sharpened stakes had unhorsed them. When they arrived at the plateau at the top of the slope, struggling in their heavy armor, they were met with a new corps of Sipahis that Bayezid had kept in reserve, rather than the escaping Turkish forces that they had anticipated. And it was at this point that the French realized how desperate the situation was, and some knights, upon seeing this, had fled back down the slope as the Sipahis charged in the counter-attack, shouting the tekbir, banging kettle drums, and sounding trumpets. As one chronicler put it, no frothing boar nor enraged wolf more fiercely fought on. Admiral de Vian, who was given the distinction of being the oldest knight to carry the French standard into combat, suffered numerous wounds while trying to rally his fellow citizens before being killed. Audard de Chazeron, Philippe de Bar, and Jean de Caroget are among the other well-known knights who were killed. When the Turks threatened to overrun Nevers, his bodyguard flung themselves to the ground in deference and begged for their liege's life. Despite the declaration of jihad, the Turks captured Nevers because they were just as interested in the wealth they could obtain by holding noble prisoners hostage. The other French simply gave up when they saw that Nevers was captured. Now, although the chronology is unclear, it seems that the Sipahis were sweeping down along the flanks in an envelopment as the French advanced up the slope. According to accounts, the Transylvanians and Wallachians decided that the day was lost and left the fields when they saw a swarm of horses that Tukman believes were jerked free from their tethers, and Hungarians and other ethnic groups engaged in confused combat on the plain. The Germans and Sigismund, and the Master of Rhodes, engaged in unspeakable massacre on both sides in their battle to stop the envelopment. An important reinforcement of 1,500 Serbian knights led by Stefan Lazarevich was sent to the Turks at this time. The force of Sigismund was overpowered. Persuaded to escape, Sigismund and the master made their way to the Venetian ships in the Danube on a fisherman's boat. The force that made the escape possible was led by Count Hermann of Seely, governor of Habsburg Carniola, and a cousin of Sigismund's late wife. He would go on to become the father-in-law of the king. Both Bayezid and his vassal, Stefan Lazarevich, were aware that Lazarevich's brother-in-law, Nicholas II Garay, was fighting alongside Sigismund. After an agreement was reached, Sigismund's army submitted, effectively ending their defeat. Later, Sigismund would tell the Hospitalier master, "The arrogance and conceit of these Frenchmen cost us the day. We had enough men to fight our enemies, if they followed our advice." Jean Froissart, a chronicler, would say, "Since the Battle of Roncesvalles, when all 12 peers of France were slain, Christendom received not so great a damage." And for now we say goodbye. But before I go, I'll thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, and Charlene. Thank you so much. As always, good night. Until next time, where we meet again. I'll always be here. Lots of love to you all. See you then.